Hello and welcome. We are here with Epsilon Omega's webinar, Preparing for the General Election, a post-primary discussion. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsor, the League of Women Voters, Champaign County. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Divine Nine Chapters, NAACP, NCNW, CU Solidarity Sundays, Bend the Arc, Jewish Action CU, ACLU, Champaign County. Thank you all for attending. And I should mention, as your mistress of ceremonies today, or the moderator of our discussion, my name is Venetria Patton, and I am a member of Epsilon Omega, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. At the end of our webinar, we will have a Q&A, so you will have a chance to have some discussion. We will handle that using the Q&A function of the webinar. So please submit your questions there, and you can submit during the course of the webinar so that you can keep track of your questions, and we will handle those during the Q&A portion of our discussion. I will also note that throughout the course of our discussion this evening, we will utilize some polls to engage you, our audience, and also to gather your prior thoughts and get a sense of kind of where you stand at the beginning of the webinar and where you stand at the end of the webinar. I'd also like to point out that only those of you on the webinar can see and engage in the polls, but we do hope to have a nice, healthy audience on Facebook Live as well. Looking forward to a very stimulating discussion this evening. Before we get into our first portion of the webinar, we have our first poll. So if we could get that pulled up. Did you vote in the June 28th primary election? So if you could indicate yes or no, and then we have a second part of that question. If not, why not? Did you forget? Were you out of town? Confused by the change in date from March or April to June? Or did you have another reason why you opted not to vote in the primary election? So please vote for the first part and the second part of that question and hit submit for us. Okay, and we are actually split here. 50% of our audience did vote in the primary election, and 50% did not. And in terms of why people did not, the biggest reason was other. So that could be a whole number of reasons. I will fess up, I was in the other category. I moved here and I didn't have my act together and I wasn't registered. I am now registered. I will be voting in November. And some people were out of town or simply forgot. Hopefully we will not have those issues and you'll be like me, you'll have your act together come November. Okay, so let's move on to the first portion of our discussion, where we're going to learn a little bit about the primary voting results. And so we have James Manrique with us from the League of Women Voters and Champaign County Voters Alliance, who will share some information with us. And Epsilon Omega member Muriel Jones will actually conduct an interview with James in order to help us unpack this information about the primary voting results.
Thank you. And so thank you for joining us this evening. And James, just want to thank you always. He has just kind of been a trooper with us. We can always depend on him to share his knowledge and his talents and his skills with us. He's our data person. And so he shares great information. And so we're just gonna jump right on in and start with questions. And so my first question is, James, can you kind of share with us the primary results? We know we did not have the turnout that, of course, ideally we would like to have. And so could you share that information with us?
Yeah, definitely. I just shared my screen here, and also thank you for the opportunity to speak and present some information. But yeah, the primary election results were pretty interesting. They were kind of typical for the county. Overall, the county turnout was 26%, and that's right near where it was for the 2018 results. And then different precincts in the county have different turnout. Some precincts turn out a bit lower than others. So yeah, it was pretty low turnout, but I mean, that's kind of average for a state primary.
So were there any groups that seemed to vote more this time during the primary than there has in the past?
Well, there's some precincts that tend to always have higher voter turnout than other precincts. Campus tends to always be like one of the lowest turnout precincts for any election. But then there's a handful of other precincts that are almost always in like the top 10. And then there's other precincts that end up in the middle. And so it's kind of interesting to see where those different precincts line up, you know, kind of depending on like who's in those precincts or what type of voters are there. But definitely depending on those demographics, there was different turnout.
So it looks like, in terms of looking at your charts, of course, we've got Garden Hills South and Garden Hills North as being the lowest. I mean, that's real low, other than the campus. And we realized students were not on campus. And so that impacted that. But it looks like Garden Hills is one of those areas that we really need to target. I know the League of Women Voters, as well as Epsilon Omega of Alpha Kappa Alpha, plans to do some foot soldier work. You know, we want to kind of knock on some doors and just, of course, we're not doing partisan information, but just kind of, you know, talk about the importance of voting and making sure that people are registered, showing them how to register on their phones and those kind of things. So it looks like Garden Hills is one of those areas that we need to target. Is there a similar precinct in Urbana?
Mainly the campus ones. There are a couple precincts in Urbana that are lower turnout. I mean, it tends to be like kind of the demographics that, you know, like the lower income demographics tend to be lower turnout, unfortunately.
Okay.
But there are a couple of precincts in Urbana that do match.
All right. Anything else that you wanted to share with us as it relates to the primary?
Not too much, just that you know, it's these primaries are very important because the vote is so low that every vote just goes that much further in deciding who shows up on the general election. And a lot of times whoever shows up, you know, whoever wins their primary can often win the general election. So really, you know, it really starts at that primary and then goes out from there. And then the 26% turnout, that's of the whole county. But for the primary, you can only vote Republican or Democrat. You have to pick your ballot and you can only vote within that party. So that 26 is kind of in half. You know, it's 13% Democrat, 13% Republican. Not exactly, the split's a little different, but essentially a very small percentage of people decide who advances to the general election. So, you know, just in general, you know, every election is very, very important. So.
And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that, you know, elections can be decided by a handful of people. And so that is part of that message that we want to get out there, that every vote is important. And so, so thank you for sharing that. So now we know who's moving forward to the general election. And so I know you have information to share with us in relation to that.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the best ways to find out like what candidates are running in Champaign County is a website that we've put together, votechampaign.org. And on this website, we list all the contested candidates that are running for different offices within Champaign County. And we also make this website just a one-stop shop for voter information. So on here, of course, the main thing is the candidate information that we provide, but we also give you links on how to look up your voter district, the sample ballot, how to check your voter registration, how to update it, and also links for voting early or voting at home or voting in person. We also provide links to other like community groups and things like that to get further involved. But of course, like the main thing that we offer is the candidate information guide. So that guide, that looks like this. At the top, you can narrow down, you know, from state to federal to judicial or on the county level. By default, it shows you all the candidates. And then in this guide, we also show, we have a random spotlight at the top for one of the random offices. There's a lot of very important elections, but there's also a lot of elections. So kind of scrolling down the page, you can kind of, you know, there's a lot of elections to go over. So we provide a random spotlight at the top to try to, you know, elevate some of those lower on elections, because all of these are important. And then also, we ask every candidate a basic questionnaire, and then we also list those answers to the questionnaire here. So for instance, you can click on candidate Q&A, and that will drop down right away the answers for their questionnaire. So we try to make it very easy to get informed on who's running in Champaign County.
Excellent, excellent. I know I've been in conversation with Ann, who's on our webinar, and we've kind of talked about, you know, maybe using this guide to pick out information about each one of the candidates who is running, and kind of share that with communities. You know, we encourage people to go to the website, but we also are aware that everyone's not necessarily going to go to the website, but we think it's important information. And so to take that information and to pull off talking points and then just kind of share that with people. And you know, of course, not supporting one or the other, but just to say, here it is. Let's talk about, you know, you know, this person's position, that person's position. So hopefully that will help.
Oh, absolutely.
Informed electorates. So anything else that you wanted to share with us?
Well, also on the guide, we also link to candidate forum videos, such as the judge election. That's one of the first ones that's available. There's going to be more candidate forum videos available as they get made. Once those videos are available, we'll also continue to link those in the guide. And you can see those videos next to those candidates. So that's one of the best ways to learn about the candidates, is just to hear their own words and hear them answer questions.
Absolutely.
So we offer that. Also, anytime that there's a district where it's not like a county-wide district, we offer a link to check your sample ballot, or to see if that shows up on your ballot. So we link you to more information, or so that you can easily find that.
Excellent.
And then I guess if I had to make one other closing statement, is that it is possible to turn around voter turnout. One of the stats that I always like showing is this from the from 2018. This was the state general election. Historically, campus has always been like the lowest voter turnout precinct. And you can see that here in 2014, 12, 6, 2, consistently very low. But in 2018, there was a local drive to really push turnout on campus. And there was some people that really went door to door, did it several times. They made multiple contact attempts. And it was possible to really push those numbers way up. So it is possible to turn it around, and it just takes a lot of hard effort from volunteers. So
yes, and I mean, and those numbers, they're remarkable, you know. And so we do want to make sure that it's that knocking on the doors, it's that personal piece, is making sure that we talk to people. The forums, or not really forums, but the conversations that Ann and I have talked a little bit about, is actually going to churches, you know, to see if we can contact some of the ministers and see if they're willing to let us come in and just share information. And so I think the more we get the information out there, and it's great that you have provided a template, a forum, information, so that it makes it easier for us to share that information, is most appreciated. So as always, James, I love the information that you share. I love the fact that you are willing to take the time and share that information with us. So thank you for your comments this evening. And I will turn it back over to you, Venethia.
Thank you, Muriel. Have a great
Thank you.
Thank you both. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and pull up our next poll. For the November 8th general election, I am most interested in learning about the candidates for A, governor, B, state legislator, C, congressional representative, D, county clerk, E, county sheriff. So please select which office you're most interested in learning about. Okay, it seems like most people are interested in learning about congressional representative candidates at 38%, but that's pretty closely followed by county sheriff at 31%. And we've already been told by James Manrique about a wonderful resource right online with the Nonpartisan Voter Guide. So that's a great resource that we can all utilize. And perhaps as this webinar continues, we'll learn about some other wonderful resources. Our next portion of the webinar will be from an expert speaker. We have with us a political scientist from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Professor Brian Gaines, and he's going to tell us a bit about what things motivate voters to go to the polls, and also share with us perspectives about the changing landscape of the voting electorate. So let me just tell you a little bit about Professor Gaines before I turn over the Zoom square to him. Brian Gaines is a professor at the University of Illinois with appointments in the Department of Political Science and at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. He received a BA with honors from the University of British Columbia and AM and PhD degrees from Stanford University. Most of his research deals with elections, electoral rules, and public opinion. Professor Gaines, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be speaking here tonight. I will start by telling you what I'm not going to do. I am a political science professor. I'm very used to giving lectures with PowerPoint presentations and having a lot of slides. And in fact, I'm a big fan of graphs, but I'm going to do this without PowerPoint tonight. So for better or for worse, you'll just see me, and I might draw some figures in the air if I get carried away. But I'll talk a little bit about, I think, what we'd expect to happen at the midterm from historical patterns from past precedents. A little bit about whether we're looking at an interesting period where the way people vote is shifting, what political scientists with our love of jargon call a realignment. And I'll be sure to leave time for questions and answers, because I don't know exactly which things might be most interesting to most people. So I will not filibuster. It won't be the length of an actual seminar. So let me talk, first of all, about what we'd expect coming up. And I'll start with the midterm. We just had a brief discussion about the midterm. The turnout was low. A lot of the press on it emphasized that it was the second lowest, and there was some maybe some fretting about why was this so? What does this mean? Does it mean we're going to see a low turnout general election? I'd begin by saying that's probably not a good prediction. That a midterm turnout, sorry, a primary turnout is not usually a very good predictor of general election turnout. When people vote for the primary, a lot depends on whether they're interesting contests. The more uncontested races there are, the lower the turnout as a rule. This was an unusual primary as well because for complicated reasons, the census data were delayed. That meant redistricting was delayed, and then they pushed the primary back. So people in Illinois are used to having a March primary where sometimes you get a late snowfall that makes you not sure if you want to trudge through the bad weather to go vote. We had it in June. Has the opposite effect. I think we saw that in the poll. Quite a few people were out of town. Students weren't on campus. So in any case, if you are feeling disheartened by a low turnout midterm primary, that doesn't mean we'll have a low turnout midterm general election. It is a midterm election, so we're going to have a lower turnout than the presidential. That's one of the closest thing we have to an iron law in political science. And apart from turnout, the other thing we have that's not quite a law, but it's a very strong regularity about midterm elections is, for a while now, the president's party has, I could choose the George Bush or the Barack Obama term, been shellacked or whacked or creamed. Presidential parties have done very poorly in recent midterms. So you think back a little bit, 2006, George Bush is in the White House and the Republicans have a very bad midterm election, lose control of the House, and lose a lot of seats up and down the ballot, state legislative level as well. 2010, we've switched presidencies and we have a Democrat, Barack Obama in the White House, and the Democrats have a terrible midterm. The Republicans just in time for the next redistricting, because redistrictings take place after the census. So the 2010 census prompts a bunch of redistricting before the 2012 election. And Republicans take control of a lot of governor's mansions, state legislatures, and they end up drawing more maps than they imagined they could have a few years before. And so for Republicans, the bright side of having lost the presidency was they had this very big midterm swing. And that was an especially important one because it was right before a redistricting period, reapportionment redistricting. We have notwithstanding a bad result in 2010 for his party, Barack Obama is easily reelected, and you have another midterm with the Democrat in the office. And 2014 was, again, not a very good election for Democrats. So third election in a row with bad result for the president's party. And then the Republicans, of course, win 2016, Donald Trump's in office, and his party gets creamed in 2018. So if you have your way of predicting, it's just what's happened before is probably going to happen again. That's not a terrible shorthand for prediction. You'd start out 2022 thinking it looks like Democrats are going to lose some seats. And if I were giving this talk maybe 5 months ago, I think I'd say almost everybody's in agreement this is going to be a bad midterm for the Democratic Party. There's a little bit more complexity in this if you're reading newspaper stories, and online newspapers I know are becoming out of date, but online newspaper stories, if you're just listening to people talk about the midterm, there's something of a debate now. There's still a set of people saying these midterm losses, they're not deeply mysterious. They're how big they are is partly a function of some simple variables like inflation. Well, inflation is much higher than we've seen in decades. I'll do my two-handed, the old joke of the king wanted the one-handed economist, so he couldn't have one hand in the other hand. I'm going to do two-handed presentation for a bit. So high inflation, bad election for the Democrats. Past precedent, last 4 elections, bad election for the Democrats. Some particularly bad incidents early in the Biden administration, I'd say, especially maybe the chaotic and somewhat disastrous evacuation from Afghanistan, left an impression of incompetence, bad for the Democrats. So a lot of stuff looking like this is an election where we'd expect to see a lot of Democrats losing seats. But complicating this a little bit, the polls and betting markets and the other favored prediction devices, the people who spend their all their time, if they're professional like me, or too much time if they're they have the politics bug and can't help watching, have started to say, well, maybe it's not going to be such a bad year for Democrats after all. And part of that was pretty maybe controversial or successful tactical interventions by the Democratic Party in Republican primaries. So in a lot of states and a lot of races, the Democratic Party spent a lot of money getting what they thought was essentially running ads in Republican races to try to get the weaker Republican to win. And in several cases, they succeeded, and some they didn't. So the Republican candidates in quite a few of these races are, and I'm thinking more at the moment of Senate and governor than the US House, though the same thing happened in some House races, are candidates that neutral observers, people who aren't, they don't have an elephant or a donkey tattooed to their chest, they're not particularly partisan, think are probably weaker candidates, and up to Democrats' chance of holding some seats. A second factor, and I'll talk about this a little more in the second half when I talk about realignments, the Dobbs decision first leaked and then announced changed the landscape for abortion politics and the impact of attitudes about abortion on voting. And there's some signs, and again, there's debate about exactly how important this is and which direction it points, but some signs that pro-choice voters are maybe more energized than they otherwise would have been, and that that will be a surge of people who maybe would have stayed home, marginal voters who in a midterm year are not being drawn in by presidential contests, but are excited about voting and adamant about trying to do something with at the ballot about a decision they didn't approve of. So that would be a second. I forgot my two hands. This is, well, maybe the Democrats won't do so badly after all. We've got this. They managed to get some weaker Republican candidates in some races. They have perhaps the newly energized base. The pro-life and pro-choice voters are not strictly Republican and Democrat, but the parties have become more and more sorted. So if a lot more people who are angry about the decision are voting, that's almost certainly going to help Democratic candidates. Inflation hasn't really gone anywhere. I would not say there's a counter argument about, well, inflation's been solved, but the Democratic Party had some legislative successes. And again, there's some debate, but maybe some sign that the sense that the party with complete control of Washington, the president, the House, and at least the Senate by virtue of the vice president's tiebreaker, so unified Democratic government with a kind of asterisk that the Senate is neck and neck, hadn't got much done. Well, they've got some more legislative achievements, and so maybe that's another thing on this hand. And then I said, well, if people don't really care why, they just want to know who's going to do well, a lot of people spend their time looking at polls and betting markets. And some of the polls, and I'll talk maybe particularly about the so-called generic ballot, where people are asked, if you're going to vote for, if you have to choose, would you vote for the Republican or the Democratic candidate without proper names? And never mind who's actually running them. I'm not going to ask Regan During and Nikki Budzinski, the candidates for Congress in your district. They just say the Democrat and Republican, who do you prefer? The Democrats have had been historically their lowest generic ballot numbers in the spring and summer, and they bounced back a little. And again, maybe then this midterm isn't really going to be another of these shellackings that we've seen so much recently. And I said inflation's not really tamed, but the price of gas, which had been sky high in the summer, I'm one of those people who was out of town when the primary took place, and I was driving across the country and paying $6 a gallon and wincing every time I had to stop at the pumps. Well, it's come down a little. So you can fashion an argument, I think, if you're just trying to figure out, well, how would I predict that this will be a big midterm swing against the Democrats? I start with precedent, and I might talk about the inflation and some other events, but I can fashion an argument on the other side, say maybe it won't really be one of those years, it'll break the pattern. Let me back up a little bit more and say, I'll come back to the polls and betting markets. And it's a pattern. Political scientists are supposed to be a little bit better than just describing things. Why does it take place? Again, there are lots of theories, lots of debate. If you've taken a political science class, you'll know we spend weeks hearing about how decades of research, more often than not, doesn't entirely resolve questions. You still have people saying, I think it's mostly about voters. No, it's mostly about candidates and spending. No, it's a mixture of those two things. No, it's redistricting. People will have a lot of arguments about exactly what's causing such a change. But one thing that's clear is it's partly about turnout decline. And the turnout decline in particular is, it could be that people who voted for the president's party, and so in 2020 voted for Joe Biden, the Democratic ticket, are disappointed and they switch over to voting for Republicans, of course, not for president, but for other offices, Senate, House, state legislative office, and so on. Some of that probably takes place, but as much as it's a disappointment for marginal voters, people who aren't the kind who would always vote the same party every election, no matter what, and there are lots of those in the country, it's also just a change in who votes. That some of the people most motivated to vote in the presidential election who get swept up in enthusiasm are going to miss out on the primary, sorry, the midterm, because they'll also probably miss a primary, but they'll especially stay home on a midterm because there's not as big a ticket, as big a race at the top of the ticket to excite them. Maybe there'll be a close governor's race. I think about Illinois, at the moment, it looks like it's not going to be an especially close race. Don't want to prejudge it. There's time yet, but I don't think the incumbent governor, J.B. Pritzker, the Democrat, is sweating a great deal. This is another race where I think Democrats got the Republican candidate they're hoping to get and are feeling like they're in good shape. The less exciting the top of the ticket races, the fewer people who maybe are kind of interested in voting, and if they're badgered enough, they'll vote, but they don't like politics that much, and they're easily distracted by things, ordinary life, and that particular day they have to go shopping, and that's enough to keep them from the polls. Well, so that kind of voter add them on, add enough of them up, and you get a different electorate in a midterm election than you get a presidential one. And I'm sort of a specialist in polls. My non-academic work was a lot of it has been working with polls, and I could take my remaining 20 minutes and talk about polls, and I could keep talking about polls until the football game is over tomorrow night. But I won't do quite so much. But one thing that's clear about polls is they're on the whole mostly about right, but they spectacularly fail every so often. So the 2016 presidential election was pretty much a spectacular failure. A lot of people who watched the polls thought Hillary Clinton seemed to have it in the bag. People maybe who think I don't know how to add these polls up, but I know that there's website 538.com, and there's Real Clear Politics. A lot of other people professionally study polls and add them up, and they all seem to say the chances of Hillary Clinton winning were something like 60% or higher. Some of them said 80%, and yet she lost. She won the popular vote, but that's not worth anything at all. We know, if you know by now, Americans, I think, have got the hang of how the Electoral College works. So why did the polls get things so horribly wrong? The polling firms have a strong incentive to persuade people when they have a bad failure that they figure it out and next time they'll do better. So a lot of pollsters put a lot of time into studying what went wrong. And the short answer is, I apologize, but it's a little bit technical. It wasn't just that people who liked Donald Trump were unwilling to talk to pollsters. That was a little bit of it. So if your polling depends critically on getting a random sample, you draw a random sample of people from a list of registered voters or random phone calls, however you get your random sample, if people that just refuse to talk to you systematically have different preferences, and in this case, they like Donald Trump more than the people who will talk to you, you're going to screw up your predictions unless you can see in something about the sample that it doesn't look right. What do you see about the sample that you would know? You don't know the result of the race until it's happened, so you don't know what you're seeing, an alleged Hillary Clinton victory is right or wrong. But what you do know is something from past examples about the gender of the electorate, the race of the electorate, the geography of the electorate, the age of the electorate. So if you're looking at the poll and you think we have too many women in this poll, it must be that men are just not willing to talk to us at the same rate as women. So what pollsters do is they weight. They put weights on the sample. And we've got a 60% female survey sample, but we think it's going to be a 50-50 electorate. So we'll put a little more weight on all the men we talk to, a little less weight on all the women. We'll weight it as though we had a 50-50 sample. So we'll count the men a bit more. And they do the same thing with geography and age. We don't have enough people who are 60 or over. We'll weight the ones we do have a little higher. We'll downweight the people who are 40 to 50. We have too many of them. You use all these variables, you apply your weights, and then you say, this is what we really predict from the poll. Different pollsters use different polling techniques, weighting techniques. It's for many of them, it's proprietary. No one wants to tell you how they've done it. It's their own secret. It's what they think will make their poll more accurate. But pretty clearly in 2016, the weights were wrong in one critical sense. They underweighted white voters who had not gone to college. They basically thought there would be fewer of them than there were. So there was a surge in non-college educated, especially white voters, a little bit true of other races as well, but more of them showed up than the pollsters had been predicting. They weren't putting enough weight on the people they did talk to who disproportionately had said they were going to vote for Trump. Go back and fix their weights after the fact, and then everything looks a lot better in the polls. So I could stop right now and say, okay, we've solved the polling problem, except that the pollsters didn't do a great job in 2018. They did a little better in 2020. In presidential years, because of the Electoral College, what really matters isn't the national polls anyway, it's state polls. In midterm years, that's even more true. There isn't a national office up for grabs here. So if you want to know who's going to win the Senate, you spend time studying the Pennsylvania polls, and you maybe look at the Nevada polls where it looks like it's neck and neck, and you need to know state by state what's going on. And if you do that and you look back and how well did these polls in these states work in 2018, 2020, then you can start to get a little worried and think, oh, some of them they worked really well, and some of them they did terribly. We had a lot of polls that had suggested there was going to be a very close race and races that were quite easily won, and mostly, not entirely, but mostly the bias was they were underestimating Republican vote. Same problem as 2016. And this is after they've done a postmortem on 2016 to figure out where the polling went wrong. So it would be a little glib and lazy if I said, so don't believe polls. That's definitely not quite the right conclusion, but be suspicious that polling is difficult. Weighting is as much an art as a science. And it's getting, if anything, harder to poll. And this is, I had the keyword of motivation in my title, partly because people are overpolled. It's harder to reach people. Traditional polling was telephone polling. You just can't get to people by telephone the same way as you once could. So we use more internet polling. But internet polling has its own difficulties. Mostly it's panelists, people who are doing polls because they get some money, some points for doing them. And they're systematically different from people who don't belong to internet panels. And that's hard to correct for. So if you're writing a term paper on polling techniques and you go read about the differences across the pollsters, that they'll all tell you they've done something to make sure that they're not going to make the same mistakes we've seen in recent years. Take it all with a grain of salt. There probably will be some errors this year, as there have been in other years. I'll switch to my realignment theme before I'm out of time, but I want to say one more thing with betting markets. In my academic lifetime, the existence of betting markets, people putting real money on who's going to win which election, has gone from, it was basically a clandestine, unobservable activity in the 70s, whatever betting occurred, no one could see it, to it's a big part of people's predictions. There are large betting markets with lots of money. Which market is used has changed over the years, and some of them have been shut down for a variety of complicated reasons. But you can go look right now, and if you're interested in doing this, and I'm not recommending this to anybody, but you can put money on a particular race. If you feel like you definitely know who's going to win the Ohio Senate race, you can go buy shares, which will pay off $1 if the Republican wins. And if you buy it for 40 cents and if he wins, you gain 60 cents. You think the Democrat's going to win, it's at 60 cents. You buy it, you get 40-cent profit. So there are people putting their own money on the line. I think an economist might say, if polls have these other problems, that it's hard to reach people systematically, let's just look at the betting markets. People putting their own money up front must really know something. Betting markets have done pretty well, but they haven't been perfect either. You could have made a lot of money in 2016 buying shares in Donald Trump just before the presidential election. And in midterm elections, sometimes they've done rather poorly. There was a lot of money to be made picking a Republican Senate in 2002. Right up until the last minute, that was not what most people putting their money in the betting markets thought, and then it turned out to be what happened. Cautionary note, and maybe it's an easy one, there's no free lunch. There isn't really a perfect prediction out there. Anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen because they've done such careful research, they're probably blowing smoke. There are lots of ways to predict the elections. Lots of political scientists have spent a lot of time with statistical models. There's some value in them, but we get surprises more often than we would if this was a more exact science and we're really predicting something like the movement of particles and the physicist might do. All right, so I'm throwing cold water on the art of forecasting and predicting to some degree, but why would we think things might turn out differently in this election? If Republicans do well, I said maybe it'll be about turnout and marginal voters who liked Democrats last time staying home, and maybe it's people mad about inflation. But the maybe more interesting question that I think is a very live debate right now amongst political scientists and pundits and others are we looking at a change in who's voting for whom and the reasons why? And I'll go back to the polls failed because of the weights, and the weights particularly about non-college educated whites. The argument right now that this might be an election where all the things I talked about matter, but they matter to different people, I think is a relatively compelling one. So for some people, who cares about inflation? They say everybody. Everybody's vote is based on three things: pocketbook, pocketbook, and pocketbook. But that's probably not quite right. I think there are people who are single issue voters who care an enormous amount about guns or about abortion or about foreign policy. They care most about what is going on in the Ukraine. So there are going to be people who aren't just voting on inflation. And increasingly, I think at least there's some signs in the last couple of elections that people with college education, and this is probably mostly true about white voters, so I'll make this a statement first about white voters, then I'll complicate it a little bit. College educated voters have a different set of priorities from non-college educated voters. And the pocketbook, inflation, personal economic situation kind of concerns are a little bit more important for people who haven't gone to college. And a different set of issues are a little more important for people who have gone to college. And I think there's a companion argument that the two parties, it's never been true the Republican Party is the party of the rich and the Democratic Party is the party of the poor, the Democratic Party is the party of the working man. But there's some basis to this sort of the stereotype. And to some degree, Donald Trump and maybe it's not just Donald Trump, but Republicans in the last few years since Donald Trump's emergence as a major political figure have been making inroads with white, blue collar, working class voters, and making up to some degree for losses that stem from the composition of the electorate. The electorate is a little bit less white than it used to be. The Republican Party has done less well with most non-white voters. And so this kind of realignment is one thing that's kept races close that might not otherwise. And thinking about this year, in particular, just a couple of things. I talked about abortion. Abortion is actually a pretty complicated issue for predicting votes. So you'll see stories saying women are registering in numbers we've never seen before, but maybe surprisingly, sex is not the strongest predictor of abortion attitudes. Age and then especially religiosity are much better predictors. So you find a church-going person, whether it's a man or a woman, and a non-church-going person, whether a man or a woman, and your prediction about which one of them is going to be more pro-choice should be based on the church attendance, not on the gender. Older people are more inclined to be pro-life, younger people much more pro-choice. And so if the Dobbs decision and abortion has become newly salient, it doesn't necessarily go with the story I was just telling about a realignment where working class voters are moving to the Republican Party, more college educated voters are voting on non-economic grounds and moving to Democratic Party. Different issue, forgiveness of college debt looks much more like it's a classic case of Democratic president using powers in an orthodox way, maybe some would say an unconstitutional way, but possibly unconstitutional, but not challengeable in court anyway, but in a novel way, using his presidential power to take a demographic, recent college graduates that's already inclined to support the Democratic Party and giving them a relatively big favor at a time when it might help his party. If we do end up in an election where the exit polls show people voting for the Democratic candidates were thinking about different things from people voting for Republican candidates, they weren't thinking about inflation, they weren't thinking about maybe the Ukraine or Afghanistan, they were talking about college debt and abortion. The people voting for Republican candidates were thinking a lot about out of control inflation and perhaps foreign policy. That one election isn't in itself a realignment, but if we see that over a series of elections, that's when political scientists start to get excited and talk about the nature of the two parties changing. And so I would definitely not say this is a realignment. I know it, take my word for it, but there are hints of what looks a little bit like a realignment, and it's something that I think for political scientists is extremely interesting to watch in the near future. One last point on that, I qualified my comments and said mostly I'm talking about white voters. The other interesting and I think for some people flummoxing or puzzling pattern has been the resurgence of Republican support amongst Hispanic voters, Latino voters, and even with Donald Trump at the head of the ticket, and of course his shadow falls over this election, but he's not on the ticket anywhere. There are still signs that Hispanic voters are more Republican than they've been in a while. They did back George W. Bush, a Spanish-speaking candidate, in 2000 fairly strongly. Both times he ran, he was running against a candidate who didn't. Al Gore and John Kerry didn't particularly have any inroads. We'll use first-person plural in speaking to a Spanish-speaking audience the way George Bush could. But it's another interesting, I want to be cautious and not say it's a realignment, but sort of a hint of potential realignment that the Republican Party is making gains with Spanish-speaking voters, not strictly of Puerto Rican descent or of Cuban descent in Florida, just the ones who are of Mexican descent in Texas, but broadly, and the actual background of a Spanish-speaking voter matters a lot. So it's not really a monolithic voting bloc, and that's pretty well understood. But there's some sign of Republican gains that, again, I think for some people who thought it's becoming a more white party, this complicates that story. And I think I had a stopwatch going here, but my phone has timed out. But I think I'm probably using most of my time, and I do want to leave lots of time for questions. So let me break off there, and I've given you two maybe half lectures, one about midterm losses and gains and one about realignment, and I'm not making sharp predictions. So if you're hoping I was going to tell you exactly what I think is going to happen tonight so that you could later say he was dead wrong, I apologize. I'm being a little hedgy and saying could go this way, could go that way, but at least I think that there are interesting things to watch for.
Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate that. It looks like we've already started to get some questions coming through, and hopefully more will continue to come in. We will go ahead with our third poll of the evening, if we could get that posted. One of the most important issues for me in the general election is A, providing health care, B, addressing gun violence, C, addressing inflation and financial needs, D, judges in the courts. Oh, and it looks like we have a tie. At 31%, we have providing health care and addressing gun violence. Although I will say addressing inflation and financial needs was not too far behind at 25%. So those are the issues that seem to be on the mind of our attendees this evening. Okay. Next up, we have Ann Prisland with the League of Women Voters, Champaign County, and she's going to share with us some updated voter education information.
Thank you, Venetria. It's always a pleasure to be here and talk about ways to think about your role and our role really in the upcoming election. So in order to do this, I'm going to share my screen. I was reflecting on what James and Brian both said about the importance of voter turnout and the types of issues that motivate voters, and how in some ways it's unpredictable. In other ways, maybe we'll follow the patterns of the past, but we'll need to find out. So let me share my screen. Okay, slideshow here. What I did for this evening was put together a series of information and resources, because I know that for many of us, we're just beginning our search for candidates and for options for voting. This presentation is going to be posted on the AKA EEO website in a day or two, and you're welcome to download it and refer to it and use it. Several important handouts are already on that website for you to use. One is a list of the key dates for this upcoming election, including timeframes for registering to vote, early voting, and for those folks who want to register and vote on the same day. The other is a list of all the candidates that will be on our ballots, listing by party, but not specific to your personal ballot. We'll get to that in a second. And again, you're welcome to download those resources and make use of them. This is my favorite quotation about elections, and I think from what James and Brian told us, that it's absolutely true, that every election is determined by the people who show up. And as James pointed out in our various primaries, a small number of voters can make a huge difference in the candidate names that will appear on your ballot in the general election, but also in the case of midterms, since the participation tends to be lower than in presidential years, our involvement in voting can make a huge difference in which candidates are actually elected. So why does it matter specifically to vote in this fall's election? I think this slide probably shows why. That if you've ever wanted to have an impact on the issues and actions taken by officials in Illinois and in Champaign County, this is your opportunity to do so. because of redistricting after the 2020 census, many more seats in the, particularly in the state legislature and the county board, are up for election than might have been true in other elections. And as you look down this page of the types of offices that are up for election, I'm sure you'd agree with me that these are the offices that are going to make decisions about the issues you care about. We just saw our poll, the importance to many people here of healthcare, or of what is going to be done regarding gun violence at various levels, and certainly attention to financial needs. Well, it's the people who we're going to elect in November that are going to make important decisions about all those issues. So whatever issue is important to you, if you can tie it to candidates and what they say they're going to do, that is extremely helpful maybe in deciding which way you want to vote in the upcoming election. So the question though is, which candidates am I going to vote for? And this is the part where I want to make sure that we're all really clear. And I'm going to get there by telling you a story about a friend of mine. She lives 5 minutes away from me in West Champaign. We've always voted for the same county board, state legislature, and congressional candidates. So I was over at her house the other day and happened to see a flyer from a state representative in a different district in her recycle pile. I asked her about it, and she said she had no idea who this person was and didn't even know why she had gotten the flyer. It must have been a mistake, but it wasn't. We checked, and although she and I are still in the same voting districts for Illinois State Senator, Member of Congress, and County Board, we are not in the same district for State Representative anymore. So what I'd like to do, if I can here, is show you. I'm going to have to do it this way. Stop sharing for a minute and then share again. I'm not sure how many of you have actually checked out your voting districts, but I want to take a minute and show you how easy it is to do this. The county clerk website has something called My Voting Information. And this page is specific to each of us as individuals. What you can do here is look up your registration status, request a mail ballot, find your precinct, but you can also, and most importantly, check out your current voting districts. There are two ways to do it. One, you need to enter your name and either the last four of your social security or your driver's license. The other easy way to do it is by your address. So I'm going to hope this works, and I'm going to enter my street address and go slowly, because what will happen is you'll get a pop-up menu here and you need to select the address that is the correct one for you. Click on View Details. And now you see all the voting information about someone living at my address. If I click right here on Voting Districts, this tells me what districts my address is assigned to after redistricting. The 13th Congressional District, the 52nd Legislative, 103rd State Representative, and County Board District 5. By the way, I don't know why this is, but see, it says 52nd Legislative District. That's really your state senator. So even though you've lived where you live now for the last 15 or 20 years, please do confirm your voting districts. Please don't be like my friend of 5 minutes away, who was going to actually research the wrong candidates who would not be on her ballot. So it's very, very simple and easy to check. And let me go back to my PowerPoint. As I said, confirm your voting districts right here on the Champaign County Clerk's website, because it only takes a couple of minutes, and then you'll be sure that you're going to do your research on the right candidates. James has already shown us the candidate guide, the nonpartisan candidate guide that I would highly recommend. It's a collection of information about candidates in contested races. And then once you have figured out your candidates and your voting districts, then the next step, of course, is to decide how you're going to vote. Make your plan to vote. I know many of the people listening in have voted by mail before. And as you know, now you have two options. You can request a mail ballot, continuing ballot, which means that you'll be receiving a mail ballot for every election you're eligible to vote in from now on until you decide that you don't want to and let the county clerk know that, or you leave the county. And you can also, of course, just request a mail ballot for one election. Many people do that, especially if they're going to be out of town when there's a primary. They want to vote by mail in the primary, but they prefer to vote in person in the general election. You can also decide if you're going to vote early. Early voting starts actually next week, September 29th. Early voting opens at Brookins for people who are already registered. I understood from the county clerk today that sample ballots, which are specific to you, will be posted on that My Voting Information location by the time early voting starts on the 29th. For the rest of the county, early voting opens October 24th. That's throughout the county, including campus. And as you probably know, all early voting sites are open to all voters, no matter where they live in the county. And of course, voting on election day, November 18th, is perfectly fine. And the interesting twist this year is that actually all voting locations, including precincts, are open to all voters in Champaign County. The equipment has been upgraded so that all polling locations can print ballots for anyone, anywhere in the county. So you have a lot of options to vote, that's for sure. And finally, these last two slides, I just pulled together all of the information resources that you may want to consult. The Illinois Board of Elections is excellent to confirm your current registration. You can also register to vote there through October 23rd. The advantage is that it's open all day and all night to do that. And here's the link to the Champaign County Elections Department. And again, that's the place to go for your personal voting information. I've included the phone number here as well. And then, as James mentioned, the League of Women Voters, our local website has lots of information about registering, voting, and candidates. We link to votechampaign.org and the candidate guide. And I've put the links here in the PowerPoint as well. So this is just a reminder to everyone of the various resources available to us so that we can put together for ourselves which elections, which races am I particularly interested in? Who are the candidates that will be on my personal ballot now that I've confirmed my voting districts? And what do those candidates say about the issues that matter most to me? And that allows us then to be the kind of educated voters that I know we want everyone in the county to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Anne. Okay, at this point, we can turn to our questions from our webinar participants. So please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box. Oh, Katina, you're muted.
Thank you. Good evening. So far, we have a couple of questions and one comment. I believe Anne just answered one of the comments relative to the sample ballots. So thanks for that. The first comment is pertaining to James's presentation. And the comment is, this is not a question, but of course a comment. It's so important to check your voting districts for county board, for city council, for state representatives, and for congressional reps, because these may have changed due to the census. So that was a comment. And if there are any presenters who want to chime in on that, please feel free to do so. Excellent. The second one is actually a question, a comment as well, asking Professor Gaines to please comment on voting and voter registration trends among young voters.
Sure. Yeah. So it's been true for, well, I was going to say at least since 1960, actually probably since the turn of the century, that age is a good predictor of voting, that older Americans vote at a higher rate than younger Americans. Sometimes people will express this as a kind of a lamentation. Why can't we get younger voters to turn out at a much higher rate? If you're trying to figure out why is this true, the simplest answer, I think, is to some degree voting is a habit. People who are my age or older have had a lot of opportunities to vote, and they've gotten used to it and gotten the habit. They've internalized the sort of sense of duty, and but they also, it isn't necessarily that they're less busy. I think the truth is almost everybody has some distractions at most phases of life, and parents have lots of things that could be pulling them away from getting around to voting. If you have to go in the booth and simultaneously chase down a couple of toddlers, it's maybe a less appealing prospect. But it's close to always true in an election that there's a pattern where the turnout is lowest amongst people, voters under 25, 18, 25, a little higher for as move up. It falls off in the very highest age group for, I think, obvious reasons as well, where then once you're past 80, then people have many more physical challenges. Though I should cue on Anne's presentation and say it's in many ways never been easier to vote. Most states have introduced convenience voting, early voting options, by mail vote. In many states like Illinois, you can choose either of those things. Increasingly, you can register on the same day. You don't have to go to a particular spot. You don't get penalized by getting a ballot that doesn't have all the contests on it. So in lots of ways, it's easier to vote. And as the costs come down, it's possible that we'll see more of a leveling out where age isn't such a strong predictor. But I think many years, there's sort of a story coming up to the election. Maybe this will be the time when young voters really catch up and vote at the same rate as old voters. It doesn't usually happen. But when we see a surge in turnout, as we saw in not in this year's primary, certainly, but in presidential elections, the level, by 96 we're falling, and then we've seen a bounce back to some degree. It tends to be a surge across all levels. So it's some people who weren't going to vote at age 60 are getting drawn to the polls and get excited. And some people who were 19 and maybe hadn't voted before and weren't going to do it still end up in a close and exciting enough contest getting talked into voting. So that's a very general kind of answer. I think the truth is the young voters and older voters almost always have a gap in turnout, but they tend to track in similar ways. When an election you see the vote fall off, it tends to fall off for about equally for across age groups.
Oh, you're still muted.
Thank you, Professor Gaines. The next one is for you as well. One of our attendees would like for you to speak to the trends of African-American voters who are consistent churchgoers.
Yeah, so I said, I'll say two things about church-going African-Americans, I think. First, I said the church attendance is a strong predictor of abortion attitudes. And that's not directly about voting, but I'm talking about an election where maybe some people are thinking about the Dawes decision and thinking particularly about if to thinking, well, state laws matter more. Maybe I need to be thinking about state legislative offices in a new way, or judges. So it's true across races that religiosity, especially church attendance, predicts a more conservative attitude. It's also true that African American voters, for not the whole history of enfranchisement, but in my lifetime, since the late 60s, the civil rights era, have been the most skewed racial group in skewing towards the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean there are no African American Republicans, of course, there are, and but it's more true than that if I said something like churchgoers vote a little bit more Republican. That's true across the races, but it's going to be more true of white voters than of African American voters. And it's Hispanic voters in between. Asian voters, Asian is a little bit like Hispanic in that it's sort of an artificial category that Indian American and Korean American voters often will have not much in common with Japanese or Chinese American voters, and we group them all together for convenience in survey questions, but it's probably, in this case, it's less true that I could find a religion effect across Asian groups, but individually, it's probably the most true for Korean Americans, for example. I think if the question was just what was the trend, I think I'd say we see the same sort of patterns we see for white voters, but shifted to towards the Democratic side, where whatever gender, age, religiosity you're talking about, once you're comparing an African American voter and a white voter, you've got a much higher probability of a Democrat with the former, with the African American, than with the white voter. But does going to church mean the voters likely to be more conservative? Yes. And does that mean they're somewhat more likely to be have a more conservative view on an issue like abortion? Yes. The last thing about church that's kind of an interesting point, and I think social scientists, it's another case, maybe we should have figured this out a long time ago, but we're still struggling. Church attending is a very good predictor of voting. So is that because people who are willing to set aside a time to go to church are the kind of people who are just generally dutiful, and they're the same kind of people who will make sure they set the time aside to vote? Or is it because they're being mobilized? They go to church and they're being reminded at the church, don't forget to vote. They're hearing it from the pulpit. And I said, we're sort of bad at answering questions like this. There's evidence both ways. Probably both things are somewhat true. It has been true historically that African American church leaders were, I think for obvious reasons, back to the 1960s, when they were just coming out of a period when there'd been enormous suppression of the African American vote, and it took great will and courage to vote. African American church leaders did a lot of direct mobilization, making sure that they told their congregation how important it was to vote, probably more so than white pastors. But I think both of those things are true, that there's a mobilization effect. People go to church, end up voting because even if it's not the pastor, they're seeing a lot of other people. They're in a crowd. Someone's going to remind them and say, hey, don't forget to vote. Please don't forget to vote. And that just being asked to vote is one of the strongest things that makes people think, I wasn't really going to bother, but I just told someone I would. I guess I'll do it after all. But it's also probably there are people who are socially connected and people who have made a decision to do something that's a little time consuming. You don't have to go to church. You could find something else to do with your time. But people who are willing to make that investment are also, on the whole, people who are more likely to vote. So there's quite a strong association across races, but and again, for I think important historical reasons, a very strong one for African Americans.
Thank you. We have two more questions. One is, any particular thoughts on why Hispanic voters tend to vote Republican?
Yeah, so I'd say I said they're trending towards the Republican Party. I want to be careful to say they're not the most Republican group. That it's if we just take these racial classifications that I just criticized a little bit and said Asians sort of a fake one, and a lot of groups aren't that similar, and Hispanics aren't that similar, but they've become a little more Republican, not nearly so much as white Americans. On the whole, I think it's social conservatism. Is it because of they prefer Donald Trump's policies on immigration to Joe Biden's? Some, in very limited sense, some do. I think some Hispanic Americans want a more orderly immigration policy and they want a more orderly border, but mostly it isn't that. It isn't particularly issues that we think of as issues that are especially important to Spanish-speaking people, particularly immigration of Spanish speakers. It's social conservatism, and that might mean abortion, but it can mean other things, attitudes about same-sex marriage. And I mean, I hadn't said as much as I was thinking I might about the Democratic Party. I said the Republican Party is the parties have almost completely sorted on abortion policy. The Democratic Party is, I think, why is it some working class whites who used to vote Democratic have moved away? There's some sense that it's a party that prioritizes issues that are especially important to college educated people, not just forgiveness of college debt, but maybe sort of symbolic politics, things like the importance of pronouns and things that for sort of blue collar workers strike them as not about their daily lives. So the more the Democratic Party is, for example, a party that's strongly in favor of, pronouns, of course, are tied to sort of gender identity and trans rights and so on. But issues like that, maybe increase the attractiveness of the party to a set of college-educated voters and decrease their attractiveness to especially socially conservative, non-college educated voters. And that's part of the story, I think, of changes in the patterns of Hispanic voters.
Thank you. And our final question for this evening's webinar is, what polls are particularly well thought of?
Yeah. I have a slight connection to YouGov. I don't have any financial interest in YouGov, but I worked on a company that was eventually absorbed by YouGov. I won't say that YouGov is especially good. I think I'll say what's interesting right now is that they're making different bets on what's the right way to reach people. So YouGov is an internet pollster, and they don't try to do telephone polling. I think it just doesn't work anymore. And it's a panel. They have millions of people who are in the YouGov panel, and they want to get a random sample of Americans. They draw a true random sample from a voter list, and then they match the panelists according to their age and their geography and their race and their gender and their maybe other things about them to try to make their panelists look like the random sample. And then, like everybody else, they have to wait. And that has advantages and disadvantages. It means that they're very good at getting people who don't mind answering 90 questions. And so they get a lot of information, and they know a lot about people who've been in the panel for a long time, and they could figure out who is it that voted for Donald Trump once and then switched away from him. So that where you need to know sort of long histories, internet pollsters have a big advantage, and sometimes that's really useful. But some of the pollsters that are doing exactly the opposite are saying the problem with polling these days is people get too many polls. They're constantly being polled. It's too easy to avoid pollsters. The manners of the past where someone wouldn't hang up on someone who phoned during dinner time, they'd still answer questions, they're long gone. You can't even reach people on cell phones. So the only way to get a representative sample is very short polls. You got to use all kinds of creative ways to reach them. It can't just be internet. Different pollsters, totally different guesses sort of about what will work in a modern world where it's in some ways the technology for reaching people is easy, texting and all sorts of other innovations, but some ways it's easy to reach people who want to talk to you. It's not easy to reach people who maybe aren't that keen on it. So I know I'm dodging. I'm not going to say these are the top three and these three are terrible. But I think if you're truly interested, it's a good master's thesis subject. But at a level of less interest than that, if you're trying to figure out, should I believe this new Quinnipiac poll says something very different from this other one, read the details about how they were done. And if one is a telephone poll, one's an internet poll, you have a little bit of an information clue about, well, why would they differ so much? It's probably partly about who's willing to talk to which pollsters and how. But I don't have I think that from the last 4 elections, if I said who's been the most accurate, it moves around a lot. 538.com rates the polls, and I think anybody that's below a B has had some spectacular failures, but almost all the pollsters have had some bad failures in recent years. There's nobody who's got an unblemished record where I'd say they just have cracked this nut. They know how to get the perfect poll.
Excellent. Thank you. Very thoughtful questions and comments from our participants this evening, and most certainly thoughtful presentations from our panelists. I will now turn it back over to our amazing moderator.
Thank you so much, Katina. Appreciate that. Thank you all for your participation this evening. I think we've had a really wonderful discussion. We've had some wonderful resources shared with us. So if you weren't prepared to vote before the webinar started, you definitely have some wonderful tools in your toolkit. The resources that were shared this evening will be posted on the Epsilon Omega website. And you can find that by going to AKAEEOMEGA.org. And if you go to programs and then select social justice, you will find information from previous programs related to our Get Out the Vote efforts, and information from this evening's webinar will be added to those resources as well. So please go visit our website. And again, that's AKAEEOMEGA.org. And of course, we want to remind you to go out and vote in the general election. And you have the opportunity to vote early if that is your preference. And you can vote in any of the voting locations. So remember to make use of your voice and to vote. I'd like to thank all of our participants, James Manrique from the League of Women Voters and Champaign County Voters Alliance, Professor Brian Gaines from the University of Illinois Department of Political Science, and Ann Prisland, League of Women Voters, Champaign County, and of course, all of my fellow members of Epsilon Omega, of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And thank you all for taking time to be with us this evening. Thank you and good night. Oh, one last poll. For the November 8th, 2022 election, I am more likely to vote for A, Democrats, B, Republicans, C, third-party candidates, D, candidates that support my priorities, or E, haven't made up my mind. Please choose a selection. And we are split, with half indicating a preference for Democratic candidates and others that will be choosing candidates based on their priorities rather than the party affiliation. Okay, so again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at other programs and events. In the upcoming months, the chapter plans to collaborate with other civic organizations to host talking sessions to discuss position points of the various candidates running for office. So look forward to those activities. Thank you.